Welcome, everyone. My name is Enlargement Dead. I am the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and it is our great pleasure today to welcome Milada Bahudova, a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's received her PhD from Oxford and has held numerous fellowships and awards since. She's a specialist on democratization and the impact of international actors on domestic politics, and especially on the transition to democracy in post-communist countries. She's written a fantastic book entitled Europe Undivided: Democracy, Leverage, and Integration, which makes this argument about the role the European Union played in affecting the transition to democracy and democratic consolidation in post-communist countries. And it has widely been awarded and justly been cited incredibly widely. It's a fantastic book that I highly recommend you read. In her more recent book, Milada focuses on democratization and its international aspects in the Western Balkans. And so today she'll be speaking on a lecture entitled EU Leverage and National Interest in the Balkans: The Puzzles of Enlargement 10 Years On. And it'll be a mercifully PowerPoint-free presentation, so we can all rest our eyes and focus on Milada instead. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Let's see if we can do this, a presentation without PowerPoint. I do have some PowerPoints, but I decided that, it's not that important, and I just like to see if we can. Lately, I've been doing some lectures without PowerPoint, but we'll talk a little bit about the data towards the end of my talk. So I just want to thank you all very much for the invitation, especially Anna. I've always wanted to come to Ann Arbor, so this is a great opportunity for me. As a little bit of background, I know oftentimes people wonder about my name. So Milada Bahudova is a Czech name. So my parents were actually from Czechoslovakia, and they were refugees from the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union in 1968. So they were actually on a kind of a camping trip throughout the United States with every intention of returning at the end of it. And they were camping in Big Bend, Texas, when they heard on the radio station that the Soviet Union had invaded. And as my students pointed out when I was telling them this story a couple weeks ago, they would have said, oh, and your parents wouldn't have known anything because the ranger station would have been closed during the government shutdown. It's like the active thinking in my classroom. But so I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, which was sort of the end of the camping trip. And my entire childhood, all I heard about was how absolutely amazing everything was back in Czechoslovakia. Because my parents were very homesick and had never intended to immigrate, which I think really changed the experience. And I was lucky enough to be in Paris as an exchange student in '89 when the Berlin Wall fell. And so I've been going back to East Central Europe since the fall of 1989. Unfortunately, given the state of Czech politics, I have to disagree with my parents. Not everything is better back home. And actually, my experience in the 90s was one of growing and abiding frustration and disappointment with my own people. And so it's actually really refreshing to be working on the Western Balkans, because many people from the Western Balkans feel very passionately about the recent history of their countries, but I have no dog in this fight. And so I don't feel the same sense of kind of personal disappointment that I always did when working on the Czech Republic and even Slovakia. I did my PhD at Oxford, and as I was telling some folks at lunch, when I got something called the Marshall Scholarship, my mom said, finally the Czechs get something from the Marshall Plan. And so I was able in the 90s, while I was doing my PhD, to spend a huge amount of time in my cases for my first book, and that's not quite been the case for the second book, obviously. Field research takes a lot of time, but I've been spending most of my time in Belgrade, Sarajevo, Zagreb, and this coming summer I'll be spending some time in Skopje, which I'm not so much looking forward to, but we'll talk about Macedonia in the talk. So, as Anna said, my research has really been on the domestic determinants of different trajectories of political change in post-communist Europe. And as I was sort of doing the research for my PhD, which was really about explaining why these countries that began the democratization process at roughly the same time in '89, with roughly the same geopolitical context and some of the same domestic conditions, why they seem to be going on such very different trajectories in the early 1990s. And as my research unfolded, I realized by the mid-1990s that the European Union had become really important in not only guiding policy changes in the countries that wanted to, that were moving quickly in terms of both market reform and creating a fair and open democratic political arena. It was also important in highlighting the countries that were not doing that. And in some countries you had, and in the 90s it was Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, you had countries where, sure, the politicians said, we want to join the European Union. All politicians pretty much in post-communist Europe have said, in East Central and Southeastern Europe have said, we want to join the European Union. But the question is, what do they do domestically, right? Do they enact domestic policies and conduct themselves in the domestic political arena in a way that's consistent with the country moving forward in the EU pre-accession process? And there has been tremendous variation. So the variation isn't in what governments say they want. They all say they want to join the EU, but it's in the kinds of policies that they implement. There's three questions that I'm going to look at in this talk. The first, very quickly, is, have the basic dynamics of enlargement changed? So when we look at the Western Balkans, do we still see that basic dynamic that we saw with the East Central European countries, where you have essentially conditionality that is effective? The second, how exactly does the EU's pre-accession process shape domestic political change? And again, does this travel to the Western Balkans? And finally, and most importantly, is EU leverage enough to improve the quality of democracy and the quality of governance in some of these really difficult cases, right? So Western Balkan cases, especially the post-conflict cases, are much more difficult in some very fundamental ways. Think of Bosnia, even Macedonia, Serbia. And here, the variation is huge, and it's not so much explained by Western policy or what the U.S. did or didn't do or what the EU did or didn't do. It's mostly explained by the nature of the domestic elites and how much you see kind of rent-seeking elites that are entrenched and that are happy with the status quo. You put the blame on them, but then you also have to look at the institutional structure, or in the case of Macedonia, the Greek veto. So those are the three questions that I want to look at. The first one, have the basic dynamics of enlargement remain the same? When you're in Europe, you hear and have heard over the last 10 years the constant refrain of enlargement fatigue, that basically in the European Union, citizens and also policymakers are tired of enlargement, that the 2004 enlargement was kind of overwhelming in some sense. But even worse was the 2007 enlargement with Bulgaria and Romania coming in, where clearly the EU's leverage wasn't sufficient or wasn't applied sufficiently strictly. And you have Bulgaria and Romania coming in 2007 with what have turned out to be really severe problems with the rule of law and the fight against corruption. And so this kind of talk of enlargement being basically dead, a lot of people have said, oh, the EU is just pretending in the Western Balkans. It really doesn't want to enlarge anymore. It's just pretending. And I actually think all of those arguments are wrong and sort of simplistic, because if you're on the ground in these countries, you realize that it's really all about the EU pre-accession process all of the time. Like, the newspapers are full of it, the government is working on it every day, the EU is there and it's very much involved with every step of policy making. And the reason is because I think the basic dynamics have remained the same, and that is that enlargement for the West European countries, or for the core EU countries, however you want to define it, is still defined basically by national interests. Important member states, on balance, think that it's better, they're going to be better off if the Western Balkans joins the EU than if it stays out of it. And this is similar to the argument that I made with Andy Moravchik, 10 years ago now, about the motivation for the core EU countries for enlarging to East Central Europe. There were a number of people who argued at the time that really this was enlargement could only be explained as some kind of, motivated by some sense of moral, historical justice, or some sense of, as Frank Schimmelpfennig called it, rhetorical entrapment. Basically, that West European countries had said that they were open to all European democracies and sort of talk themselves into a corner where they had to let these countries in even though they didn't want to. And there's actually very little evidence for the drivers of European integration, the main countries, especially Germany, doing anything like that against its will or its interests. And I think the really important thing to remember is that it's only through the EU accession process that the EU has any hope of locking in stability, democracy, market reform. Another way to think of it is there is not a single country on the EU's borders that is not a candidate or proto-candidate for EU membership that is stable, democratic, Western-oriented, and has a sort of thriving and improving market economy, right? So those countries that have been excluded from the EU accession process, none of them are heading in that direction. And so the option of just saying, well, we don't really want to let these countries in, so let's just have them as kind of associate members, and we know they're going to behave themselves well as associate members. That's really not an option. And we see that today with Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Turkey. None of these countries qualify as countries with robust democracies and sort of stability exporting countries. So on balance, and especially for the Western Balkan states, given the history of the wars in the 1990s with the disintegration of Yugoslavia, it's a much safer bet to have them in the pre-accession process. Now, this creates some problems for the EU, especially in Bosnia, because the EU wants so much to see Bosnia make progress that sometimes it's not tough enough on Bosnia, and this has discredited the process. But on balance, I think enlargement is still very much driven by national interests. And it's important to remember that a lot of the costs of enlargement are externalized on the new member states, at least in the short run, right? So there's transition periods for things like free movement of workers. There's tough bargaining about any derogations from the acquis for new members. And at the end of the day, it's a story of the new members wanting that deal to go through and caring about that deal going through much more than the old member states. And so any new member that's negotiating for membership is inherently in a weak position. And so any kind of concerns that the old member states have, they can usually get them addressed pretty handily. Now, again, that doesn't mean that there haven't been changes and that the process hasn't slowed down. And one of the things which has been so evident is the learning that has gone on because of Bulgaria and Romania, right? And the consensus there is that Bulgaria and Romania came in too soon. There was not enough conditionality in very important areas, particularly in building up state capacity and creating independent institutions, especially the judiciary, right? So all of this takes a lot of time, and that's one of the reasons that the process has been so slow. Now, on the side of the candidates, it's also the same basic equation. The benefits of membership create a lot of incentives to satisfy the requirements, even though the requirements are pretty tremendous, right? This is, now 110 or 120,000 pages of acquis, which these countries just have to adopt. They can't debate it. They can't change it. They just have to adopt it. And I was always laughing in the late 90s when some of my colleagues got so outraged that the Hungarian parliament spent, 4 weeks just rubber stamping EU acquis. But I didn't find that to be such an affront to democracy. And as we see, it wasn't enough to save Hungary. But a lot of this stuff is it's mostly technical, non-controversial stuff. It's mostly about creating a level playing field in the internal market, right? And so that's sort of the volume of the acquis. But it is a very laborious and long process if you compare it to anything, and it's really not comparable to any other international organization or anything that a state would have to do to get in. One of the things which is interesting, because for the Western Balkan states, this really is a very long process. So we're talking maybe, even if you start the clock at 2000, for Serbia, it'll be a 20-year process, right? So Milosevic's regime fell in 2000. 20 years of being a kind of candidate or proto-candidate and then a candidate for EU membership. And in Serbia, they also always like to say, we want to join the EU as equal partners. Well, that's just not how it works, right? You've got tiny countries trying to join an enormous, powerful international organization. And so the balance of power is very much against the candidate countries. But what is still so astounding about this is that at the end of the day, if you are a candidate for membership, you get a seat at the table. And that has so far not been watered down. There's a lot of talk about a two-speed Europe and a core and periphery Europe, but in fact, with the exception of the Euro and Schengen, pretty much there's just one style of membership. Now, if you're a big country with a big population, you have more more political weight in the EU's institutions. But there's plenty of places where it's kind of one country, one vote. And the change of geopolitical fortune for these countries is just tremendous, right? Like if you think about the position of, say, a Poland, in interwar Europe before World War II, and you think about the position of Warsaw today as a member of the European Union, it's a really it's something worth going through, geopolitically worth going through that long, long process for. But in fact, what most countries think about are the economic benefits, and in the Western Balkans, as much as in, or even more than in East Central Europe, there's really no possibility of economic revitalization without the EU market. And so already these countries are almost entirely integrated in the EU market. It's just a question of making them, hopefully, through full membership, more attractive to foreign investment. Because that's one thing that these countries have missed out on. If you compare it to what happened to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and even Bulgaria and Romania, where you had a big influx of foreign investment, because of the economic crisis and also because of geography, conceptions of political instability, they have been really shortchanged in terms of foreign investment and need desperately to catch up. Okay, so if these two sort of basic parts of the equation are still there, despite all the Euro gloom and enlargement fatigue, right? That the old members want enlargement to the Balkans because of national interest. The new members want to get, or the candidates want to get in because of national interest, especially economic benefits. How does this actually impact domestic politics? And what I have been looking at already in my first book, but now even more so in this project, is not the policy making that comes out of all of this, because some of that is some of it is relatively straightforward in terms of just adopting the acquis. And other parts of it are really a project in themselves. And I think that's one of the things that not only the EU has learned, but also scholars who look at EU enlargement, that trying to understand how you shore up independent institutions in a democratizing state is an incredibly complicated question. And the EU didn't quite know how to do it. For Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, in some ways it got lucky. It was like, okay, you guys need to build these institutions. They built them in different ways. We see in Hungary that some of the institutional choices were poor ones in ways that no one probably could have ever anticipated. But there wasn't a lot of hand-holding. But now we see with Bulgaria and Romania that the institutional needs are tremendous, right? That there needs to be much more surveillance or partnership in terms of building robust institutions. But before you can get to that partnership, you really need political parties that are on board. And you need something more than just the government being on board. You pretty much need a national consensus in terms of cooperating with the EU pre-accession process. And so in, I think, 2008 or so, I published an article looking at adapting. And there I argued basically that for political parties in these countries that are candidate countries for the EU, you really have two waves. In the first wave, you have the kind of anti-authoritarian, pro-West, center-right parties that tend to adopt a pro-EU agenda. And a pro-EU agenda becomes kind of shorthand for democratic reform and a more or less fair open political arena, along with market reform and a pro-Western foreign policy. And in countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and Slovakia, this pro-EU position was really an anti-authoritarian position, right? Because these were countries where you had illiberal governments that were in power in the 1990s with kind of catastrophic consequences in some ways for certainly for the quality of democracy, but also for the EU accession process. So being pro-EU was kind of being anti-Mečiar in Slovakia, anti-Iliescu in Romania, anti-BSP in Bulgaria. But the really interesting part is the next part. So when the pro-EU parties finally gain power, that's great. They tend to be a little bit timid. They tend to be coalitions of everybody against. But the really exciting part is when those old authoritarian parties themselves transform into a pro-EU parties. And that was pretty nice to see that in Romania and Bulgaria and Slovakia. But what has actually been just beautiful has been to see that happen in the Western Balkans. So in Croatia, it was almost stunning. Like I still sort of think about it, and I can't believe it happened as quickly as it happened. Tudjman's party, the HDZ, lost power in 2000. And by 2004, they were back. They had won the elections. They had completely transformed themselves under Sanader into a pro-EU party. And most of the work for preparing Croatia to join the EU was actually done under by his political party, by the HDZ. And more recently, what has been so strange and spectacular is in Serbia to see the same thing happening, to see in Serbia you had first the Socialist Party, so Milosevic's party under Ivica Dačić changed their platform pretty profoundly to a pro-EU party. That doesn't mean they decided to say all the right things about Kosovo by any means, but in terms of the future and European integration. And I got asked to give lectures for the Socialist Party youth on the EU. And I thought, well, socialist is great, but Milosevic's party, am I allowed to go in there? What will happen to me? Will I feel horrible about myself? But actually, this is a big party, and what they want is to govern, right? That's what they wanted. And they figured out that to govern, they needed to change and to become pro-EU. And those young people in the party are actually pretty cool. They kind of, well, as long as you don't talk about certain subjects, they're certainly very keen to learn about the EU. And then next you had the split of the Radical Party. So the Radical Party is beyond, this is probably the most extreme right-wing party that has existed in Europe since 1989. It was Šešel's party. This is the party that was sending, paramilitary squads to Bosnia during the early 1990s. And Šešel is in The Hague right now on trial for war crimes. His party split, and it split because of European integration. Basically, Alexander Vučić, who's now the most powerful politician in Serbia, and Nikolić, who's the president of Serbia, decided that the only way the party could go forward is to have a pro-EU agenda. And so they split and took most of the party membership with them. And they've been governing Serbia since spring of 2012. And what has been so striking about this is that they have been doing everything that the pro-EU parties that were in power before didn't manage to do. So Boris Tadić and his party, the Democratic Party, had almost absolute political control in Serbia, but still didn't manage to do domestically any of the reforms that the EU was asking for. And they made some steps towards regulating relations with Kosovo. But it's only when these former extreme right-wing folks won the elections that we've had a huge breakthrough on Kosovo. So think of sort of Nixon going to China, right? They have the political capital to do it, and are apparently just mean and willing to, let their old allies kind of fall while they ram through this pro-EU Kosovo policy. They've also rounded up some of the biggest tycoons in Serbia and put them in jail, which nobody expected. And my personal favorite is that they've taken on the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is sort of a strange and spectacular moment. Ivica Dačić said last spring when I was actually in Belgrade, some of the Orthodox priests decided to have a death mass for the government because they had been negotiating with the Kosovars about regulating relations. And, Dačić, instead of sort of kowtowing to the Orthodox Church, which is what these parties had been doing for years, went out and said something along the lines of, "What have the heavens done to deserve representatives like this on earth?" And made a series of other jokes like that. So, what is really interesting about this, there's a number of things, but Sanader in Croatia, but also Vučić and Dačić in Serbia, they've basically stolen the EU agenda of what we thought of as the pro-Western, pro-EU parties. They have taken on the toughest issues, in the case of Serbia, Kosovo, and then also anti-corruption. And they have managed to do something which reminds me of what the Polish and the Hungarian communists managed to do back in 89, 90, or early 90s, which is they've managed to take their electorate with them. So I've been looking at some of the opinion poll stuff that the government has had, some of the surveys that they've had conducted for their own use. And you can see that the average voter for these parties was actually not that pro-Kosovo or not that anti-EU to begin with. But during the short space of the time that this government has been in power, so that's, a year and a half, those voters have moved like a lot in terms of moving to what we would consider the center. So being sort of okay with joining the EU or even happy about it, and okay with Kosovo becoming, if not, you can't say independent, but you can say lots of other things, having having complete administrative autonomy from Serbia. They're like, yeah, whatever, right? But even on the independence question, they have moved. And so it's really a striking example of a party, whatever, if Vučić gets hit by a bus today, or if Vučić becomes more nationalist today, it is still amazing how much he has managed to take a big chunk of the Serbian voter. And these were the voters that we always thought made Serbia special, right? We always thought, well, Serbia is that one place where the extreme nationalists still have a chance of winning elections. Like winning, right? Not just getting 15 or 20% like in the Czech Republic, but winning. Well, that's not true anymore because those extreme right-wing parties not there anymore, and the voters aren't there anymore either. They've managed to move them. So that's pretty exciting if you study parties like I do. So those are the two success stories. And what is really interesting is now that this Kosovo agreement has been brokered by the European Union, so it's been a really big breakthrough for the EU's new foreign policy establishment under Catherine Ashton, which has sort of been grasping for anything to sort of show that it actually still has leverage in Europe. So that has been good not only for Serbia and Kosovo, but also for the EU. There's also some indication of greater domestic pressure for reform. This is where I always get concerned, right? So where are we going to get kind of ongoing pressure for accountability, high-quality democratic governance? It has to be domestic pressure. And that's one thing that we've learned from when these countries joined the European Union. That kind of outward leverage is pretty much gone. And what quality of policymaking and governance you had really depends on domestic politics. I mean, always primarily depended on domestic politics, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't see so much variation. And I think the big difference between the countries is how much pressure you have domestically reform, how well are citizens organized, what is the role of not just civil society groups, but also interest groups. And these are all fabulously weak in the Western Balkans. And so the worry is not another Hungary, right? People kind of are, I think most of you are familiar with what's going on in Hungary, where you have kind of the destruction of the liberal part of democracy by the Fidesz party, the Fidesz government, which is really concentrating power in its own hands. And concentrating power using very overtly and in some cases extreme nationalist symbols and rhetoric. That's not really the big danger, I think, in the Western Balkans. Vučić could never get away in Serbia with what Orban is getting away in Hungary. But the danger is more Bulgaria, right, where you go through the motions of joining the EU. You go through the motions of politicians saying, yes, we want to do all these things for the EU, but then you find that the institutions were poorly reformed and that there's very little kind of concerted domestic there are a few domestic mechanisms of accountability that really work. Now, if Bulgaria is the big fear for Serbia, well, the nice thing about Bulgaria is now that we've had, 4 months of protests in Bulgaria against the mafia state. So, Bulgaria is basically a case of extreme state capture by the kind of mafia elements, but the Bulgarian citizens are in the streets protesting. So my fear for Serbia would be a kind of an outcome like Bulgaria without the people in the streets protesting. But we'll see. The question there becomes whether the EU has become smart enough to prevent another Bulgaria. Let me just say a couple things about the cases that haven't worked, that are definitely in trouble. And they're both very strange cases, I have to say. The first is Macedonia, where things seem to be going reasonably well. We had a pretty strong reform drive on the part of the government. We had political parties that were learning to live with the Ohrid agreement, where power sharing was going reasonably well. And then the Greek veto just stopped everything. And so, my kind of theories about parties and how they change in reaction to the EU pre-accession process can't operate in a country where the EU pre-accession process has ground to a halt because the Greeks, for their domestic benefit, can't let go of the name dispute. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but it's one of these things where you think it's stranger than fiction, right? Like no one could make this up. I've had to walk out of countless conferences now because the minute the Greeks bring up the Macedonian name issue, it's over. Like that's all they're going to talk about for the next 2 hours. You might as well go. And the Macedonians have responded. Unfortunately, essentially this has empowered the nationalist right-wing elements within Macedonia and within certain Macedonian political parties, and they have now embarked on a kind of megalomaniacal nationalist project of concentrating power and building very strange statues in downtown Sofia. But there's no leverage. Skopje, sorry. There's no leverage because the Greeks have basically vetoed any progress. So you can't say, if you do this, you'll move forward, because there's no moving forward at the moment. The other case that's not working is Bosnia. And there, it's really a case of the elites just being incredibly pleased with the status quo. And the status quo is one where the Dayton institutions have basically severed the relationship between the citizen that votes and the political parties. There's almost no relationship there because there's no competition. Bosnian citizens only vote for parties that represent their own ethnic group. And so as a result, if you're a Bosniak, you've got 2 parties to choose from. If you're a Bosnian Serb, you've got 2 parties roughly to choose from. And if you're a Bosnian Croat, you've got 2 parties to choose from. But those 2 parties basically don't offer anything different. They're basically the same. And there's collusion amongst the elites in all 6 of these parties. And the collusion appears to me to leave things exactly as they are, which is a situation where no one's fabulously wealthy. The one thing I like to remind people in Bosnia is that there's not that much wealth there, so the people who are rent-seeking are actually not that rich. I've seen their houses compared to the Czech rent-seekers, whose villas are astounding. But still, that's what they're doing. They're basically, it's a rentier state. There's so many people who work for the government at some level, and any kind of reform would threaten their sources of their, either just plain paychecks or the sources of their rents. And that can be siphoning off of utilities, of all kinds of different things. And what's so frustrating, I think, is that there doesn't seem to be a way out because, again, the EU pre-accession process hasn't worked. So the EU says you can move forward if you do these 3 things. The Bosnian Serbs say, well, we'll do those 3 things as long as that doesn't mean transferring any power from Republika Srpska to the center. And sometimes you can do that, right? Like you can brand cattle each in their, the Bosnian Serbs can brand their cattle and the Federation could brand its cattle. They just need to have an agreement that they'll brand the cattle in the same way. The EU would be happy. The EU doesn't necessarily need things to be centralized in Bosnia. But then the Bosniaks will not go along with anything that is seen as reinforcing the division of Bosnia into the Federation and Republika Srpska. And so then nothing happens, right? And then the EU gets frustrated and sort of says, well, okay, we said you had to do this, but actually you just have to do this. And they back down from their demands, which destroys the whole credibility of the process. Every time I give a talk in Washington, D.C., especially at the State Department, I always get 3 or 4 questions. Why has the EU not fixed Bosnia? And I'm sort of polite for the first 2 or 3. And then by the 4th, I'm like, well, the EU didn't create the Dayton institutions. The Dayton institutions have to be the worst institutions ever created for any country ever. Okay, that's a hyperbolic statement, but like just being in Bosnia, you can't even believe these institutions. They're completely dysfunctional. And there's no way to really reform the institutions because of the entrenched interests. And so there's really no way for the EU to kind of swoop in and use EU leverage to change Bosnia. So that's actually a very sad story. Okay, I think I'll end there because I don't really know what the questions are, all kinds of different ways, questions people could have. So please feel free to ask anything about not just EU enlargement, but EU politics. I'm happy to do my best. Yep, in the back.
In the case of Bosnia, I'm curious on just in the past few weeks, one of the big sticking points it seemed was the Sejdić regime.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any, do the contours of an agreement even exist, or, and if so, what would that, in your opinion?
That's a good question. So I don't know what happened in the last 2 weeks. So, but nothing, right? Okay. No breaking developments. You know, there's been the contours of several possible agreements. The problem isn't so much finding language. It's that no matter, it's as far as I can see, there are politicians within the SDP in the Federation and some politicians in RS, particularly Dodik, who just don't actually want this to go through, right? And so it always looks like they're coming up with language that probably would work, and then something happens. And the EU's position now is you don't even have to pass it, you just have to come up with a credible plan, right, to get the SAA in force. Because the EU thinks once the Stabilization and Association Agreement is in force, it will have a lot of new sources of leverage and ways to cooperate with the elites. In some ways, though, this is the EU's creation. I said I wasn't going to criticize the EU too much, but Miroslav Lajčák, who's actually a very smart diplomat, he was the high rep in Bosnia, and he instituted this, because of all the gridlock, he instituted this now norm of the 6 party leaders meeting in the back of some cafe and sort of hashing out their problems. But actually that removed things from the normal political process. And now what happens in Bosnian politics is you're not paying attention so much to the parliament or to what's being argued in the media. You're waiting for some meeting in a cafe somewhere, which is going to bring some kind of resolution. And so far it hasn't on this particular issue. I don't know if all of you know what it is. It's basically the fact that Bosnia has been sued in the European Court of Human Rights because the only way that you can hold a higher office in Bosnia is if you're Croat, Bosniak, or Serb. And so Sejdić Finci are a Jewish and Roma citizens of Bosnia, basically saying, how is it possible that I'm not even eligible as a citizen of my own state to hold one of these high offices?
I was wondering if you could talk more about what allowed the parties in Croatia and Serbia to transform themselves and to become these good pro-European Union integrationists.
What allowed them?
Or what led them to? I mean, why did you switch?
Mm-hmm.
Where's the capacity?
Well, the switch, Sanader is now in jail, which is really interesting, and I'm trying to interview him. So in the case of the Hadeze, it was really, I think, a legacy, and it happened very quickly with the Hadeze, and I think that it was a legacy of the fact that Tudjman had always been pro-Western. He'd been anti-EU in the sense that he wasn't willing to do what the EU told him. He was presiding over a full-blown, vicious authoritarian regime, and a regime which had taken part in genocide in Bosnia. But but he was profoundly pro-Western, and his message to the Croatians was always, we are Western Europe. You know, we belong with Paris and Berlin and London. And in fact, he removed everything that was quote-unquote Balkan from the Croatian museums. So the first time I was in Zagreb, I went on a search for anything from south of Zagreb, and indeed it was all gone. And so in terms of their kind of identity, right, the Croatians always saw themselves as belonging with Western Europe, and nothing had ever contradicted that. And so it wasn't hard for the HDZ to sort of say, well, you know, this whole period of war is behind us. You know, we have nothing else to fight for. I mean, the Croatians, it wasn't hard, right, because they were able to drive out their Serbian minority with the blessing of the United States. There's been no serious attempt at having the Serbian refugees come back. So there's no more there's no national issue left really in Croatia, unless Bosnia, and pretty much the parties haven't gone there. So the HDZ was able to sort of declare a victory and say, okay, now we move on to our future, and our bright future has to be with the EU. It's harder for Serbia. It's more interesting for the Progressive Party, because for them the 1990s is a story of defeat, right? Defeat on every front. And here people keep psychoanalyzing Alexander Vučić, but, you know, he has come out with the most interesting statements. This man was the press secretary for Milosevic, right? Very young man. At the time, he's exactly my age. But he's basically said things like, now we have to pay for all of our mistakes. And that means Kosovo is gone. Corruption has destroyed Serbia. We have to put these people in jail, and we've spent way too much money. We have to have austerity. And he says it with this kind of Frankenstein, like the whole world, you know, sitting on my shoulder, and somehow I'm going to do it. He's very authoritarian within his own party. His own party has absolutely nobody else. If he was hit by a bus tomorrow, I don't know, the party would collapse. And it's very right-wing and it's kind of authoritarian, like they really look up to him. And that's one of the reasons he's been able to do it, that not just his party members, but his voters just idolize him in a kind of scary way. Yeah. Yeah.
Follow up on that question about identity here. There's sort of like talk about a broader European identity versus national identity, and you get a stronger sense in terms of Western Europe. So I was wondering what about in the Balkan states? Is there a growing sense of European identity and sort of a diminution of national identity?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a kind of a controversial premise, I think, for Western Europe, right? So some people would argue the opposite, that right now with the financial crisis and the contracting of the European economy, possibly Germany's behavior as kind of the bully on the financial bloc, and immigration, that there's actually been a resurgence of national identity among West European states, right? And the UK talking about leaving the European Union. And I think the data shows that extreme right-wing parties are not particularly surging. We always think that they're surging because I think we're all sort of appalled whenever they do well, but there hasn't been a big surge. So it's not clear that European identity is going up in Western Europe. I would argue that if European identity has a chance to sort of flourish anywhere, one of the places is these candidate countries, right, where at least for a while, you know, disappointment comes sooner or later. But for young people in particular, the process of joining the EU does foster, I think, a kind of European identity, a kind of alternative. And in the Western Balkans, it's particularly important because they were so isolated in the 90s. And into the 2000s, like, people couldn't travel. So my students, I teach now at the University of Belgrade, the older students, you know, went through their entire college years without having ever left Serbia. They didn't want to go to their immediate neighbors, and they couldn't go anywhere else because of visas. So I think that retarded this kind of feeling, growing European feeling in the Western Balkans, because the visa-free regimes came so slowly and people couldn't travel. Like, I couldn't invite people from the region to conferences because it was a very humiliating and long process just to get a Schengen visa. But like in I mean, Anna would know better than me, but I get the sense in Poland and now also in the Czech Republic and Bulgaria and Romania, a kind of, among young people in particular, a greater kind of European identity. And the Bulgarians and Romanians are funny, especially the Bulgarians, because they hate their own and mistrust and have such a low opinion of their own government that they will actually embrace European institutions and on opinion polls have a greater European identity than, say, the Dutch or the Swedes. You guys should all ask questions. Yes?
Hopefully it won't be the last question, so that we don't end up on the sad story. But to go back to Bosnia, is there chances of Croatia and Serbia trying, well, more Croatia, try to help with the accession agreement, or to change some of the Dayton, slowly get away from the structure. I know that you said Croatia would, they're looking to the west. They maybe not want to get involved with Bosnia.
It's difficult, right? I mean, Croatia has the relationship with Bosnia that Hungary has had with Romania, in the sense that it will give a passport to all the Bosnian Croatians. And it will, I think, in the medium, it has already invested, so there's a lot of foreign investment from Croatia into the Croatian regions of Bosnia. There are also some problems with trade now that Croatia has actually joined the EU and Bosnia hasn't. But in terms of putting pressure on those parties, maybe. But, if that was ever going to happen, it would be happening now, because the current Serbian government is actually not friendly with the crazy right-wing, well, I don't know what you call him, Dodik in Republika Srpska, who's an American creation. That's sort of the irony, right? So Dodik was the alternative to the political party that prosecuted the Bosnian War among the Bosnian Serbs, the party of Karadzic and Mladic. Dodik was the alternative, the social democratic alternative. And when he opened his offices in Republika Srpska, he had CIA protection. We were so excited about Dodik. And now he has turned into this really instrumental, rent-seeking nationalist. What's interesting about Dodik is that he has some of the same problems that Milosevic did in Serbia, in the sense that people in Republika Srpska don't oppose him because of his what we would consider offensive nationalism, right? Things like, wanting to build an Orthodox church right next to the graves in Srebrenica. But they are upset with him about the level of graft, right? The fact that the Republika Srpska has become like his own personalistic little mafia economic empire. And so there's possibility that he would lose the elections and there'll be some political movement in Republika Srpska. And, it's imaginable that there could also be some political movement in the federation at the same time, and that you could elect politicians that wouldn't be so far apart. It's just that there have been 2 or 3 kind of false dawns in Bosnia already where, and this is one area where the U.S. government has really tried to find people and support them so that we could get past this ethnic identity and ethnic competition in politics. And it hasn't happened. The SDP, which is now in power in the Federation, the Bosniak SDP, was the social democratic multicultural alternative to the nationalist SDA. And today the SDP is behaving just like the SDA. To the point of even calling up civil society organizations and telling them what to publish and what not to publish, and just generally, misusing the police force. And I just have to say, I think it has to be the structure of those institutions that just make it impossible to create that kind of accountability between citizens and their politicians. There seems to be none. I never thought I'd say that there's more accountability in Serbia than in Bosnia, but there we are. 10 years ago, if you'd said Serbia is the great hope of the Balkans, people would laugh you out of the room. So.
I didn't intend to ask this question, but I will, if you won't mind answering it. How much really does the core European countries really want this country full-fledged members, and how much of it is they're just giving them sort of hope so that they remain friendly but yet in limbo, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
So, almost like Turkey, having applied for 50 years, and still, at this point, they're just giving up hope. So I don't know if I've conveyed.
No, it's a great question. So there's two parts to the question, so let me take them in turn. In the EU's enlargement process, the EU has so far never opted for anything but full membership. And so, let's see, I feel so old when I say this, but 89, 2013, so what, 25 years almost? So, okay, but the EU accession process didn't get going. So we've got 20 years now of people thinking the EU is about to shortchange these candidates and give them some kind of inferior membership. 20 years now, and it still hasn't happened. And so, as much as I think the process is driven by national interest, and I don't think that it's because they're being kind. I think it's because the core member states see that only through full membership can they actually kind of secure these countries as part of the EU. That some kind of association status just hasn't worked. And that, I think, is doubly true with the Western Balkans, because here, what do the Western Balkans have to offer the EU? Not great economic opportunities. It's a tiny area. The economy's tiny. That's good, too, because it means from the point of view of the EU budget, it's a tiny expenditure. But what they have to offer is geopolitical stability, right? And the headaches, for example, on Kosovo, to finally see that breakthrough happening now, I think particularly for the Germans, but other countries has been kind of gratifying. So I think that, and I know I've done interviews about this, it's always hard to sort of say because the politicians in power in core West European countries today are different from 5 years ago or 5 years from now. But generally speaking, the consensus is that you can't just have them be friendly and keep them in limbo. Those things don't really work in the medium term. Now, there's a lot of criticisms for why the accession process has been so slow with the Western Balkans, and that's where some of these concerns come from. And the answer really is very difficult initial conditions. Yes, the economic crisis has mattered, but it's been Bulgaria and Romania. After those countries turned out to be such a disaster, there was a huge rethinking. And one of the things which, conditionality only works if you're willing to say no. Right? If you're willing to say, you didn't reform your judiciary, well, then you're not moving forward. And that's what we've seen over and over again now, them basically saying, well, you haven't done it, and so you're not moving forward, most recently with Albania. And so I think from the point of view of leverage, you have to cheer when they say that. Because Bulgaria and Romania is not, they're fine, they're going to be fine. But from the point of view of the citizens of Bulgaria and Romania, they would have done much better off with 5 more years and more leverage. And Turkey's a very difficult thing to compare because you can never say quite what happened first, right? Well, you can say what happened first in the sense that the French in particular said Turkey will never join unless there's a referendum in France. And so if you think about the incentive structure for the Turks, are they going to go through all the way through the pre-accession process, adopt 120,000 pages of acquis and reform all of their major ways of doing things, only to find on election day that the French have said, oh no. So that was never going to work, right? That really undermined the meritocracy of the whole project. But at the same time, Turkey is so very, very far from meeting a lot of the EU requirements and now it's not even a democracy, as far as I can tell. I'm not a Turkey expert, but Erdogan looks like a classic kind of semi-authoritarian rentier state. I'm afraid that some of my friends in the Balkans are sort of looking towards Erdogan and thinking this is what we want. And so it's kind of hard to really, it's kind of hard to blame the EU. You can blame the French for sort of undermining the basic meritocracy of the project, but then the Turks have done so much to kind of give ammunition to the people who say, well, this country's so far from what we want to see. Another way to put it, I don't think you can compare the countries that are officially in the pre-accession process with any other country. It's a world of difference. So all those Western Balkan states are officially in the process. Kosovo is now officially in the process. Just yesterday, they started negotiating their stabilization and association agreement. And from the point of view of the EU, that is like completely different than their relationship with Moldova, Ukraine. And then there's Turkey, which is like its own special thing. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks so much, everyone.